He saw 2 pink lines, and walked away. For years later, he wept at her grave, while their daughter cried beside him. The morning light filtered through the high-rise apartment's floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a soft glow over the marble countertops and cold, minimalist furniture. Emma stood barefoot in the bathroom, her heart pounding in her chest, her hands trembling as she held the thin white stick in front of her. The second pink line had appeared slowly, faint at first, then undeniable. 2 lines. She stared at them for what felt like hours, her breath caught somewhere between panic and joy. She pressed a hand to her stomach, already feeling something shift inside her, something small and quiet, but impossibly powerful. She didn't know how Nick would react. They had never talked seriously about children, not really. There were offhand remarks, his obsession with control, his dislike for unpredictability, his need for order in every corner of his life. But they had also shared real moments. Late nights, whispered promises, dreams about a house far from the city. Emma had allowed herself to believe that maybe, someday, he'd be ready for more. Maybe this baby would be a beautiful surprise. Something they hadn't planned but would welcome together. When she heard the front door open and close, she quickly slipped the test into the drawer and walked into the living room, her pulse racing. Nick was standing near the kitchen island, scrolling through his phone with that familiar distracted look on his face. His tailored navy suit clung perfectly to his frame, his blonde hair slightly tousled, as if he hadn't slept well. He looked up when he noticed her, and a faint smile tugged at his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I need to tell you something," Emma said, voice softer than she intended. He set the phone down and gave her a sharp, businesslike nod, the same expression he wore in boardrooms. "What is it?" he asked, already half bracing for whatever disruption might be coming to his perfectly controlled morning. She took a breath, walked toward him, and placed the test gently on the counter between them. His eyes flicked down. It took him only a moment to understand. There was no dramatic reaction. No words. No visible shock. He just stared at the test for a long, silent moment. Then, without looking at her, he picked up his phone, grabbed his suit jacket from the back of the chair, and walked to the door. "Nick," she said, voice cracking. "Please, say something." But the door had already closed behind him. The silence that followed was unbearable. It rang through the apartment louder than any argument. Emma collapsed onto the couch, holding her stomach with one hand and covering her mouth with the other. Tears blurred her vision, but she didn't make a sound. She couldn't. The pain didn't leave room for it. She had known he could be cold, distant, even ruthless in business. But never with her. Not like this. She thought their connection meant something deeper. Now she realized that perhaps she had been in love with the idea of who he might become, not who he truly was. In that moment, as the sun climbed higher and lit the polished, soulless apartment, Emma knew that whatever future lay ahead for her and this baby, it would not include Nick. She would do it alone. Not because she wanted to, but because he had made the choice for both of them the moment he walked out. The days following Nick's departure blurred into one another like smudged ink on wet paper. Emma found herself packing bags she hadn't expected to need, slowly stripping away pieces of a life she thought she was building with someone who loved her. She left the apartment 2 days after the silence, without leaving a note, and without another word to Nick. He hadn't called. He hadn't asked. That silence told her everything. Her tears had dried into something sharper, resolve. It wasn't the kind of strength born from anger. It was the quiet, aching kind, the kind women discover when they know they're about to raise a child alone. Emma moved to a small coastal town in Oregon, where she had spent one summer as a teenager. It was the last place in the world Nick would ever look for her, and that made it feel safe. The ocean air smelled of salt and pine, and the town was dotted with worn-down cottages, flower boxes in windows, and neighbors who nodded hello without asking too many questions. She found a place to rent, a weathered little house with creaky floors, a fireplace that smoked if you weren't careful, and a porch that faced a narrow dirt road. She found a job working remotely for a design firm that didn't care where she lived as long as she met her deadlines. She built a new routine, quiet and small, but hers. Her pregnancy was not easy. She was sick more days than not, exhausted from the inside out. There were mornings when she couldn't keep food down, afternoons when her vision blurred from dehydration, and nights when the loneliness cut so deep she thought she might collapse beneath it. But every time she thought she couldn't go on, she would place a hand on her growing belly and remind herself who she was doing it for. The little heartbeat inside her gave her purpose when everything else had fallen away. When Ava was born, the world shifted on its axis. Emma had seen beautiful things in her life: sunsets in Santorini, snow-covered Paris streets, fields of lavender in Provence, but none of them compared to the moment she held her daughter for the first time. Ava's tiny, perfect face was framed by wisps of blonde hair, and when she opened her eyes, they were so startlingly blue Emma had to look away for a moment. She saw Nick in those eyes, and for a heartbeat, she wondered if he would have felt the same awe if he had stayed. But then Ava yawned, curled into her chest, and Emma let herself believe that everything was as it should be, even if it wasn't fair. The first year passed in a haze of sleepless nights, early morning feedings, and quiet walks along the coast. Emma would wrap Ava in a soft blanket and carry her down the cliffside path to the beach. She talked to her daughter like she would a friend, about love, about mistakes, about courage. She never spoke Nick's name, but in the privacy of the crashing waves, she admitted to Ava the truth: she had loved him. She still did, in the ghostly, hollow way people love someone who abandoned them too gently to hate. Then came the diagnosis. It started as fatigue. Then pain in her lower back. She assumed it was motherhood, exhaustion, stress. But when she collapsed in the kitchen one morning with Ava screaming from her high chair, she knew something was wrong. Tests followed. Scans. Words no young mother should have to hear. Stage 2. Aggressive. Chemotherapy. She didn't cry when the doctor told her. She just asked how long she had if the treatment didn't work. Then she asked how long she might have if it did. Her only thought was Ava. Who would raise her if Emma didn't survive? Who would tell her about the way she used to giggle in her sleep, or how she liked the smell of lavender on her pillow? Emma started treatment immediately. Her body weakened. Her hair fell out. Her skin turned pale and thin. But she kept working. Kept reading bedtime stories. Kept smiling for Ava. Her love for her daughter became a kind of armor. And when she had no strength left to cry, she would press her cheek to Ava's and whisper promises into the dark. Emma never told Nick. She kept that decision close to her heart. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was fear. Or maybe it was the knowledge that he had chosen not to care when she was at her strongest. Why would he come back for her when she was at her weakest? But Emma didn't die. At least not then. She responded well to the treatment. She had months of remission. Moments of real joy. Ava grew into a bright, curious child with a laugh that made strangers smile. Emma decorated her room with stars, painted her name on the wall, and built a life that felt whole, even if part of her still wondered what could have been. Then, a year later, the cancer came back. And this time, Emma knew she might not survive it. So she did the bravest thing she had ever done. She told Sarah the truth. She handed her a sealed letter, a birth certificate, a collection of photos, and said, "If something happens to me, he needs to know. Not for me. For her." Sarah promised. And Emma, finally, let herself rest. The storm was still coming. But for now, in the quiet of that second year, she let herself believe her daughter would be okay, even if she wouldn't be there to see it. It was a gray morning in Manhattan when Nick Lawson received the call. He had just stepped into his office, coffee in one hand, phone in the other, already scanning emails before he even sat down. The voice on the line was unfamiliar, calm but fragile, as though it was holding something too delicate to drop. She said her name was Sarah Mitchell. She asked him if he remembered Emma Carter. The question struck him like a cold wind. He stood still, fingers tightening around the phone, every thought in his mind grinding to a halt. Of course he remembered Emma. He remembered every detail of her, the way she smelled like rain when she walked in from the street, the way her eyes lit up when she laughed, the silence that filled the room after he walked out that day and never looked back. Sarah hesitated, then said the words that made his blood run cold. Emma had passed away. She had been sick, cancer. It had returned and taken her quickly. Her funeral was tomorrow. Nick felt the world around him shrink. He hadn't spoken her name aloud in years. He had never once tried to find her, though he had thought about it, in the quiet corners of lonely nights, in the moments when everything in his life felt too perfect and yet somehow hollow. But he'd always stopped himself. Cowardice disguised as logic. She had moved on. She had made her choice. That was what he told himself. But Sarah wasn't finished. Her voice changed, more urgent, more intimate. "You need to come," she said. "Emma wanted you to know, she didn't tell you, but she had a daughter. Your daughter." There was silence. Long, disbelieving silence. Nick dropped into the leather chair behind his desk, unable to process what he was hearing. A daughter. A child he never knew existed. A child he had walked away from before she ever took her first breath. His throat tightened. He wanted to deny it. Wanted to say it was impossible. But in his gut, he knew. He had always known Emma would have carried that truth quietly. Would have chosen to raise a child on her own rather than force anything from him. He didn't even think about it. He booked the earliest flight out of New York that afternoon, cleared his schedule indefinitely, and told no one why he was leaving. On the plane, he sat staring out the window, the city vanishing beneath him, replaced by clouds and regret. He couldn't imagine what she had gone through. What he had missed. What he had allowed to happen because he hadn't had the courage to stay. The funeral was held in a modest chapel in a quiet Oregon town he'd never heard of. When he arrived, he stood outside for a long time, watching people gather in dark coats, holding umbrellas against a steady drizzle. He didn't recognize anyone. He felt like a ghost walking into someone else's life. But then he saw her. She stood near the front of the small gathering, blonde hair slightly damp from the rain, a small stuffed bear clutched in her arms. She was tiny, no more than 4 years old, and she wasn't crying like the others. She just stood silently, her face pale, her blue eyes too large for her face, staring at the closed casket with a kind of knowing sadness no child should have to carry. She looked exactly like him. The shape of her mouth, the line of her jaw, those eyes, his eyes. And yet there was something of Emma there too, something quieter and warmer. She was the blend of a love that never had the chance to bloom. Nick's heart broke in a way he didn't know was possible. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. All the guilt, all the time, all the wasted years crashed down on him in that moment. He had missed her birth. Her first steps. Her first words. He had missed it all. And now Emma was gone, and he would never be able to tell her he was sorry. That he had been afraid. That he had loved her, even if he hadn't known how to show it. That he would have tried, if only he'd stayed. He stayed at the edge of the crowd, unsure whether he even had the right to be there. After the service, Sarah approached him. She didn't judge him. She didn't yell. She just handed him a small envelope. "She left this," she said. "For you." Inside was a letter. Emma's handwriting. Neat, elegant, full of grace. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you've finally learned the truth. Her name is Ava. She has your eyes, your stubbornness, and your love for puzzles. I didn't tell you because I wasn't sure you wanted to know. And I was too scared to be wrong again. But now that I'm not here, she needs someone. Someone who will show up. Not perfectly, just consistently. I'm not asking you to fix anything. Just be better than the man who walked out. I believe you can be. Nick held the letter to his chest as the rain soaked through his coat. He looked at Ava again. She still hadn't moved. Her small arms wrapped around the bear like it was the last safe thing in the world. He knew he couldn't erase the past. But maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to begin again, not for himself, but for the daughter he never knew he had. The days following the funeral felt like moving through fog for Nick. Every step he took in the small town was uncertain, as though the ground beneath him was shifting with every decision he made. He had rented a small place near the edge of town, a temporary home while he tried to figure out what to do next. It was strange to him, this quiet, this simplicity. The silence in his high-rise apartment back in New York had always been cold and controlled, but here, the silence felt like space, like the calm before something important. But nothing was more unfamiliar than the thought of being a father. That word still felt foreign in his mouth, yet it now shaped every hour of his day. Sarah had been helping with Ava since Emma's death. She was the closest thing the little girl had to extended family, and she made it clear that Emma had trusted her deeply. Sarah offered to keep Ava for a while longer until Nick could figure out what kind of role he wanted to take. But Nick knew right away, there was no decision to make. He had already missed the beginning of his daughter's life. He would not miss anything else. The only thing he needed now was Ava's permission. It wasn't easy. The first time he visited Sarah's house, Ava didn't speak. She hid behind the living room armchair, peeking out at him with wide eyes that seemed to search his face for some kind of answer she wasn't old enough to ask. Nick sat on the floor, leaving distance between them, and didn't try to coax her out. He simply said, "Hi. My name's Nick. I knew your mommy. I'm here to see how you're doing." She didn't reply. Not that day. Not the next one either. But Nick came back every single afternoon. He brought coloring books, notepads, puzzles. He read stories aloud even when Ava wouldn't sit next to him. He talked about the sky, about the trees, about the birds outside the window. He never once mentioned the word Dad. He didn't want to take a place in her life, he wanted to earn it. Eventually, she started sitting closer. She would hand him a crayon without saying a word. She would nod when he asked if she wanted juice. One day, he made a silly mistake in a story, swapping the names of characters, and she laughed. It was a small, sudden burst of sound that made Nick freeze, then smile so wide it almost hurt. That night, he sat in his car outside the house for nearly an hour, just breathing, overwhelmed by the idea that he had made his daughter laugh. With time, Ava began asking questions. Who he was. Why he came back. What happened to her mom? Sarah had told her that Emma had been sick, that she had loved Ava very much, and that people didn't always stay even when we want them to. But she had left the rest for Nick. One afternoon, sitting under a tree in Sarah's backyard, Ava finally asked the question he knew was coming. "Did you know about me?" Nick took a long breath. The wind rustled the grass, and he looked at her tiny hands, her serious eyes, the way she sat so still when she wanted to hear something important. "No," he said gently. "I didn't. I didn't know you existed. But I should have. I should have been there anyway. I should have stayed, even if I was scared." "Were you scared of me?" "No," he said immediately, tears forming before he could stop them. "Never of you. I was scared of myself. Of being a bad dad. Of not knowing how to love someone right. But I love you now. And I'm learning." Ava didn't say anything. She just stood up, walked over, and sat down beside him. She didn't take his hand, but she leaned against his arm, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. And for Nick, that was the loudest yes she could have given. From that day forward, things shifted. Nick enrolled in parenting classes in town. He started attending school meetings with Sarah, learning about Ava's routines and preferences. He asked questions. Listened more than he spoke. Every night, he reviewed legal documents about guardianship and custody. He wasn't trying to claim Ava out of obligation. He wanted to be her father in every sense that mattered. And Ava let him. She began calling him Nick with a softness in her voice. She let him braid her hair, even when the braids were crooked. She asked him to stay for dinner. She drew pictures of their afternoons together and stuck them to Sarah's refrigerator. He wasn't replacing anyone. He was building something new. One evening, when he tucked her into bed after reading 3 books in a row, she looked at him sleepily and asked, "Can you come back tomorrow?" Nick nodded, his throat tight. "Every day, if you'll let me." Ava smiled, eyes already drifting shut. "Okay." It was the beginning of something neither of them had expected but both deeply needed. A father learning how to become one. A child learning to trust someone new. And in the quiet of that 4th chapter of their lives, it was enough. Not perfect, not finished, but enough to begin healing. Nick had never imagined what his life might look like with a child, but now that Ava was becoming a part of it, everything else began to lose its sharpness. The skyline of Manhattan, the pressure of board meetings, the chase for profit margins, it all felt so distant, as though it had belonged to someone else. He spent less and less time thinking about business and more time in the quiet rhythms of a small Oregon town where he was no longer a CEO, but simply Nick, the man who brought a little girl to the park, helped her tie her shoes, and listened when she talked about colors and clouds and dreams of flying. There were still awkward moments. He sometimes stumbled over routines, forgot what snack she liked, or which stuffed animal had to be nearby at bedtime, but Ava never scolded him. Instead, she corrected him gently, patiently, like she understood he was learning. Nick read every book he could find about parenting, but none of them taught him the things Ava showed him with just her gaze or the way she'd silently reach for his hand in new places. He was still unsure of how to handle the nightmares she had, the sudden outbursts when something reminded her of Emma. Sometimes it was a song, sometimes the scent of lavender, and she'd freeze or start to cry without knowing why. Those moments crushed him more than he could explain, because no amount of comfort felt like enough when you knew what the child truly needed was someone who could never come back. He never tried to replace Emma. He talked about her often, because Ava did. Emma had been her entire world for 4 years. Every painting on the fridge, every blanket folded at the end of her bed held Emma's touch. So Nick honored her. He let Ava show him pictures, tell stories, repeat phrases her mother used to say. He kept Emma's memory alive not as a ghost between them but as a light guiding them forward. He even visited the cemetery regularly with Ava, letting her choose flowers, watching her speak to the grave as though her mother could still hear every word. He stood nearby during those visits, quietly, respectfully, letting her have that sacred space. As the weeks turned into months, their bond deepened in ways Nick hadn't expected. He found himself smiling more. Laughing more. He started to carry a photograph of Ava in his wallet and found excuses to mention her in conversation, even with people who had no idea who she was. When he sat down for coffee at a local diner, he brought her drawings with him and looked at them like they were masterpieces. Once, after Ava ran to him in the park and threw her arms around his waist, calling him by his name like it was something sacred, one of the other parents nearby gave him a look, a knowing look, not of judgment, but of recognition. And for the first time in a very long time, Nick felt like he belonged somewhere. Still, he couldn't shake the weight of what he had missed. Emma's death haunted him in quiet moments. He'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, thinking of all the ways he had failed her. The test she had held in her hands. The silence he had responded with. The door he had closed behind him without a word. Sometimes he'd imagine what it would have been like if he had stayed, if he had been braver. Maybe they would have been a family from the beginning. Maybe he would have been holding her hand in that hospital room instead of learning about her funeral from a stranger. That regret lived in him like a scar, always there, even when it didn't hurt. But he never let it stop him from trying. Every day with Ava was a choice. A chance. A promise made quietly through action. He enrolled her in art classes at the community center and sat through every session, clapping louder than anyone when she finished a project. He built a small bookshelf in her room and filled it with stories about adventure and bravery. He made her favorite spaghetti on Thursdays even though he was terrible at cooking, and once nearly set off the smoke alarm. One night, after Ava had fallen asleep beside him during a movie, Nick carried her to bed and stood in the doorway for a long time, watching her breathe. The moonlight cast soft shadows across her face, and he thought of Emma again, not with sadness this time, but with something like gratitude. Because she had given him this. Even if she never knew it, she had changed the course of his life with one silent choice, to raise Ava on her own, and to let love grow where it was once abandoned. And now, Nick finally understood what love truly meant. It wasn't dramatic confessions or perfect timing. It was showing up, again and again. It was listening. It was learning. It was forgiveness, even when it wasn't spoken aloud. It was the way Ava said, "Good night," with complete trust. The way she reached for his hand without hesitation. The way he now looked in the mirror and saw someone he didn't hate. For the first time in his life, Nick Lawson wasn't running away from responsibility. He was running toward something, toward someone. And in Ava's quiet presence, in her questions, her laughter, her needs, he found the beginning of a new kind of purpose. Something real. Something lasting. Something worth every tear and every second he'd lost. Nick had always been a man who thrived on structure. In his corporate world, structure was power, it was numbers, deadlines, and decisions that shaped entire industries. But nothing had prepared him for the type of structure fatherhood required. It wasn't about calendars or quarterly reports. It was about knowing that Ava needed her stuffed animal before falling asleep, or remembering that she hated apples with the skin still on. It was about learning to listen to her even when she didn't speak and understanding that sometimes the silence between them meant more than any conversation. One crisp Saturday morning, Nick stood in the kitchen of their rental house, pouring pancake batter into uneven circles while Ava colored at the table behind him. She hummed to herself, occasionally stopping to ask if he thought dolphins could talk or if clouds ever got tired of floating. He gave her answers that were half serious and half imagined, which seemed to satisfy her curiosity. That was the rhythm they'd fallen into, simple, warm, and fragile in the way that all new beginnings are. He had traded power lunches for peanut butter sandwiches, and somehow, it felt like the greatest promotion of his life. He began preparing for the future with a quiet urgency. Though his lawyers in New York were confused by the shift in his priorities, they didn't question when he asked them to begin the guardianship process. He wanted to be more than Ava's visitor. He wanted to be her home. He filled out documents, signed affidavits, gathered medical records and personal references. Sarah helped where she could, always supportive but never interfering. She had promised Emma she would protect Ava, but she also knew when to step back and let something real unfold. Nick also started attending therapy, something he had once scoffed at as unnecessary. Now he sat once a week with a quiet, older man who asked him questions no one else had ever dared to. Questions about his father. About why he had run from Emma instead of embracing her. About why it had taken death for him to finally step into life. These sessions didn't give him answers so much as they gave him the ability to stay present, to forgive himself slowly, to admit that he was capable of change. Ava never asked where he went on those afternoons, but she always noticed when he came back calmer, more open. In the meantime, the bond between them continued to grow in small, meaningful ways. Ava began leaving her drawings on his pillow, stick figures of him and her and sometimes Emma, always holding hands. He started reading her longer books, letting her fall asleep to the sound of his voice, her head tucked into the crook of his arm. She let him brush her hair, something she had never allowed anyone else to do, and he took the task as seriously as any business deal he'd ever negotiated. Each tangle he worked through felt like one more knot slowly loosening inside his own chest. One evening, after a community center event where Ava had shyly performed a short poem on stage, she climbed into his lap while they sat on a bench in the park. The stars were just beginning to show, and her voice was quiet when she spoke. "Do you think Mommy sees me?" Nick looked down at her, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and answered without hesitation. "I think she sees everything, sweetheart. I think she's proud of you every single day." Ava nodded and then asked something else, something even quieter. "Do you miss her?" This time, he took longer to answer. He didn't want to say something that would hurt her or sound too heavy for a child to carry. "I miss who I didn't get to be for her," he said finally. "But I'm trying to be that person for you." She didn't respond right away, but she rested her head against his chest, and he felt her small fingers wrap around his. It was the kind of moment that made all the noise of his past go quiet. That night, while tucking her into bed, she asked if he would stay with her until she fell asleep. He did, lying beside her on top of the covers, listening to her breath slow into sleep. In that room lit only by a nightlight shaped like the moon, Nick realized that love wasn't about grand gestures or poetic declarations. It was in consistency, in showing up every day, in accepting the mistakes of the past but not letting them define the future. The official guardianship was approved the next month. A judge in a quiet courthouse handed Nick the papers that declared he was Ava's legal parent. But for Nick, the real moment had already come, on a bench under the stars, with a child leaning into his chest, asking questions only people who understand loss can ask. The documents were just proof of what they both already knew. He was her father. And from that day on, there would be no more running, no more silence, no more unspoken words left behind in the wreckage of what could have been. They were building something real now, imperfect, yes, but deeply, undeniably theirs. Autumn arrived slowly, painting the town in shades of amber and gold. Leaves drifted from the trees like quiet reminders that time was moving forward whether anyone was ready or not. For Nick, it had been nearly a year since he had stepped into Ava's life, and every season that passed seemed to bring with it a deeper layer of understanding, about himself, about parenthood, and about what it meant to truly love someone without condition. Ava was growing. She had started kindergarten, and Nick walked her to school every morning, her tiny hand in his, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders as she skipped beside him. He had learned to braid her hair neatly, pack her lunch with the exact snacks she liked, and listen to the endless streams of thoughts she shared, about dragons and jelly beans and which kids in her class didn't understand how to be nice. But with growth came new emotions. Ava was starting to ask harder questions, the kind Nick couldn't answer with stories or soft distractions. One evening, as they were putting together a jigsaw puzzle on the living room rug, she asked why he hadn't been there when she was a baby. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation delivered in her usual soft, curious tone. Nick froze for a moment, the puzzle piece in his hand suddenly heavier than it had any right to be. He sat back, meeting her eyes, and told her the truth as best as he could, about fear, about mistakes, about how he hadn't known how to be a father back then. He told her how brave her mother had been, how much she had loved her, and how sorry he was that he had missed those first precious years. Ava looked at him for a long time, then crawled into his lap and rested her head on his chest without saying a word. In that silence, Nick felt forgiven, not with words, but with trust. And that kind of forgiveness meant more to him than anything he could have asked for. He found himself thinking about Emma more often, not with guilt, but with gratitude. He remembered the way she used to stand by the window with her coffee, the way her laugh could fill a room, the way she had looked at him in the days before everything fell apart. He wondered what she would say if she could see him now. Would she be proud? Would she think he had changed? He didn't know. But he hoped so. He carried her memory carefully, not as a wound but as a compass. On days when he didn't know what to do, he asked himself what she would have done, and somehow, that always led him in the right direction. One weekend, he took Ava to a cabin near the coast, just the two of them. It was the first real trip they had taken alone, and Ava was full of questions about everything: how long it took to build a cabin, whether seagulls had families, why the moon looked bigger near the water. They roasted marshmallows by a fire, told each other made-up stories, and slept side by side in the loft, wrapped in blankets while the wind whispered through the trees. It was simple, but perfect. Nick realized during that weekend that he didn't miss his old life, not the parties, not the accolades, not even the comfort of his penthouse apartment. Everything he needed now was right in front of him, staring up at him with bright blue eyes and sticky fingers. As fall deepened, they started a new tradition: Sunday visits to the cemetery. Ava would pick flowers from the local market, and Nick would bring a folded letter, something he wrote every week and left at Emma's grave. Sometimes they read them aloud together, sometimes they didn't. One Sunday, after placing her bouquet down, Ava turned to him and said, "Mommy's not really gone. She's part of everything, isn't she?" Nick nodded, his voice too thick to reply, and hugged her tightly, overwhelmed by the wisdom in her small voice. That night, Nick sat alone on the porch, looking out at the quiet street, a mug of tea warming his hands. He thought about how far they had come. The man who had once walked out of a room in silence now ended every day with a bedtime song and a promise whispered into the dark. He had learned how to make space for someone else's needs. He had learned how to stay. And most of all, he had learned that real love was not measured by how perfectly it began, but by how fiercely you fight to make it right, even after everything has gone wrong. He hadn't been there in the beginning, but he was here now, every single day. And for Ava, that was enough. For him, it was everything. Winter arrived gently that year, with quiet snowfall and skies the color of pale stone. The days were shorter, but somehow felt fuller, filled with a rhythm that had become second nature to Nick and Ava. Their life was no longer something fragile and uncertain. It had shape now. It had warmth. Nick had settled permanently in the town, buying a modest house just a few streets from the park Ava loved. It wasn't grand or luxurious, but it had everything that mattered: a sunlit kitchen where Ava could color while he made breakfast, a small yard where she could play in the snow, and a bedroom she had helped decorate with glow-in-the-dark stars and a handmade sign that read, "Our Home." Nick was still learning, every single day. There were moments when he doubted himself, when Ava's tears caught him off guard or when her silence stirred fears he hadn't yet shaken. But they faced those moments together. They talked through nightmares. They made up silly songs on the way to school. They celebrated small victories, like learning to tie shoelaces or finally riding her bike without help. Nick took photos of everything, kept every drawing, recorded her laughter like it was the most valuable sound he'd ever known. And it was. It truly was. In late January, a letter arrived addressed to Ava in a handwriting Nick didn't recognize. Inside was a package from Emma's college roommate, someone who had found a box of things Emma had left in storage and wanted Ava to have them. They opened it together on the living room floor. Inside were photos, old journals, and a sealed letter with Ava's name on it in Emma's handwriting. Nick's hands trembled slightly as he passed it to her. Ava held it like it was something holy. She asked him to read it aloud. Emma's words were gentle and full of light. She told Ava stories about her first kicks, about the way she used to dance in the womb whenever music played, about how every part of her pregnancy felt like magic. She wrote about love, not the kind that fades, but the kind that anchors, even when people aren't physically present anymore. She didn't say much about Nick, only that people can change and that sometimes it takes time for the heart to catch up with the truth. She ended the letter with a wish, that Ava would grow up to be kind, curious, and strong, and that whoever stood by her would do so with their whole heart. Ava didn't cry. She smiled softly and said, "She knew you'd come back." Nick didn't try to explain the ache that bloomed in his chest. He just pulled her into his arms and held her tightly, grateful beyond measure that Emma had left behind not just memory, but love in the purest form. In the spring, Nick officially adopted Ava. It was a quiet ceremony at the courthouse, attended by Sarah, a few close neighbors, and Ava's teacher, who had become like family. Ava wore a pale yellow dress and held Nick's hand tightly the entire time. When the judge asked if she wanted to say anything, Ava looked up at Nick and said, "He's always been my dad. This just makes it real for everyone else." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. That night, they celebrated at home with a picnic on the living room floor. Ava danced barefoot to her favorite music, and Nick joined her, even though he was terrible at dancing. He didn't care. Nothing mattered except the sound of her laughter and the glow in her eyes. They ate ice cream for dinner and watched movies until she fell asleep in his lap, her head resting against his chest just like she had that very first night she let him stay. Time passed. Slowly. Beautifully. Nick returned to work, but not in the way he had before. He worked remotely part-time, choosing projects that mattered rather than ones that simply made money. He volunteered at Ava's school. He coached a little league team even though he didn't know the rules at first. His life was no longer measured by success, but by connection. Every year, on the anniversary of Emma's passing, they visited her grave. Ava brought letters. Nick brought flowers. They sat side by side and talked to her like she was still part of their world, because in every way that counted, she was. Nick had once believed love was something you either had or lost. But now he knew better. Love was what remained when the rest was gone. It was what you chose every day, in moments both big and small. It was what you passed on. As Ava grew older, she asked fewer questions about the past and more about the future. Would Nick be there at her graduation? Would he help her learn to drive? Would he walk her down the aisle someday? And Nick answered, yes every time, not because he could see the future, but because he had already decided that no matter what, he would never walk away again. In the quiet glow of their new life, there was healing. There was peace. And most of all, there was hope, the kind that Emma had believed in even when she was gone, the kind that lived now in every word Ava spoke, in every smile she gave, and in every step Nick took beside her. Their story wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And it had found its ending in the most unexpected, beautiful place of all, beginning again.